the velvet halls of power, behind golden crowns and stained glass lies, the English monarchy has hidden its weirdest truths. Not the stuff they teach in school, the real stories. The king who died from overeating fish. The queen who lost 17 children. The royal who changed history with a bad breakup. This isn't your average history lesson. This is 99 facts about English royalty you never knew. A parade of absurdity, tragedy, scandal, and strange obsessions. From Viking kings to corgi queens, it's time to pull back the velvet curtain and see just how bizarre royalty really gets. Before we dive headfirst into the royal madness, make sure you subscribe because, trust me, this is just the beginning of the chaos. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Noon in New York? We want to know who's staying up late with kings and queens. King John's handwriting was so bad he needed subtitles. Before he was the guy with the unfortunate Magna Carta moment, King John was just your average medieval disaster with the handwriting of a tipsy spider wearing roller skates. Apparently, this royal scribe from hell wrote so illegibly that his letters had to be rewritten by professionals. Imagine being so bad at writing that people build an entire support team just to make you legible. In the world of monarchs, that's basically a mic drop failure. And yet, this was the guy trusted to sign one of the most important documents in British history. Honestly, it's a miracle the Magna Carta didn't accidentally declare war on ducks or legalize juggling in Parliament. But that's medieval administration for you. Slap a seal on it and hope for the best. Still, if you think illegible chicken scratch is peak royal weirdness, wait until you hear about the king who left the throne to plant petunias. Edward II, the Garden Queen. Edward II, warrior king, ruler of England, and proud gardener-in-chief? That's right. In a time when kings were busy lopping off heads or jousting into oblivion, Edward was out there tending begonias and building elaborate water features. His prized creation? A royal botanical wonderland at Kenilworth Castle, complete with exotic plants and elaborate fountains, basically the medieval version of a spa day with compost. You can almost picture it. Nobles returning from battle, covered in blood and glory, while Edward's yelling at a groundskeeper because the azaleas are too emotionally aggressive. It's no wonder his nobles had trust issues. Being ruled by a king more interested in fertilizer ratios than foreign diplomacy doesn't exactly scream military genius. But hey, at least the man had a vision. And a green thumb. Unfortunately, that thumb couldn't stop the political disaster of his reign. But while his crown wilted, his garden bloomed. Speaking of blooming, what if I told you the next king could speak Latin, French, and English because he actually read books? Henry I, the polyglot king who actually knew what he was signing. In the royal game of telephone that was medieval diplomacy, Henry I was the rare king who didn't need a translator or a crash course in basic Latin for insecure monarchs. The man spoke multiple languages fluently, Latin, French, and English back when English was basically a guttural hobby practiced by peasants and drunks. This was a guy who could read his own treaties, decode religious texts, and write his own letters without relying on some hungover monk with an inkwell. In other words, he was the one monarch who could confidently say, "Yes, I actually know what I just agreed to." Revolutionary. But intelligence is no protection from death by lamprey. Despite all that brain power, Henry I died after stuffing himself with a pile of slimy, eel-adjacent fish. That's right, a polyglot, a philosopher, and an educated ruler defeated by dinner. Still, credit where it's due, he set a high bar. And speaking of high standards, what happens when a king's heart is literally too big for his chest? Richard the Lionheart's heart got the VIP treatment. Richard the Lionheart didn't just conquer castles, he conquered the afterlife's interior design standards. When he died in 1199, his heart was embalmed and buried separately from his body, which is medieval code for, "This organ deserves its own throne." While most of us hope for a modest gravestone and maybe a few flowers, Richard's heart ended up in a lead box in Rouen Cathedral, like some kind of royal horcrux. It wasn't even found until 1838, when some very surprised people probably thought they'd discovered a medieval lunchbox. Inside? Powdered human heart, wrapped in linen and smelling faintly of 800 years of unearned chivalry. Scientists later analyzed it and found traces of frankincense, herbs, and mercury, which is less like embalming and more like trying to mummify someone using a holiday candle and medieval snake oil. Richard may have spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, but his heart stuck around longer than his tax policies. A bit ironic, considering he treated England like a cash cow to fund his crusading side quests. But don't worry, our next monarch stayed much closer to home. In fact, he basically lived at the dinner table. Edward IV, banquet king of bloat. Edward IV didn't just rule England, he devoured it. If monarchy were a competitive eating sport, Edward would have been its undisputed champion. Known for his monumental love of food and wine, the man turned banquets into marathons. These weren't just feasts, they were food-based war crimes that lasted days. Chickens, pies, barrels of claret, and mountains of pastries, his court was basically the medieval version of a Las Vegas buffet with fewer regrets and more gout. By the end of these blowouts, guests probably needed wheelbarrows and repentance. Even Henry VIII, who was no stranger to a turkey leg, would have raised an eyebrow at Edward's gastronomic ambitions. And the best part? Edward somehow stayed tall, handsome, and battle-ready through it all like a gluttonous Renaissance action hero. Of course, a lifestyle like that doesn't exactly come with a long expiration date, but before you judge him too harshly, remember, it's hard running a kingdom. Sometimes, a man just wants to unwind with 30 courses and a river of red wine. Still, while Edward feasted, the next king fasted, like barefoot pilgrimage through London kind of fasted. Henry VI, the Holy Ghost in a hoodie. If Edward IV was a walking Renaissance buffet, Henry VI was a fasting monk cosplaying as a king. This man took piety to an Olympic level. We're talking barefoot walks through the streets of London as king. That's not just humility. That's the royal equivalent of handing in your crown and saying, "I'm good, thanks. God's got this." Henry VI wasn't your typical war-hungry, throne-grabbing monarch. He was soft-spoken, devout, and spiritually allergic to confrontation. Unfortunately, he ruled during a period when everyone was grabbing swords and declaring civil wars like they were Pokemon battles. Not ideal. While his enemies were plotting and his nobles were backstabbing each other in Latin, Henry was praying, constantly. It's like putting a monk in charge of a biker gang, admirable, but slightly doomed. His inability to handle the throne's mess led directly to the Wars of the Roses, which is basically England's most expensive family feud. But let's not be too harsh. Henry gave us a new model of kingship, one without ego, ambition, or functioning political instincts. Still, even the most devout king can't compete with the queen who shredded expectations and the harpsichord. Elizabeth I, Queen of the Lute, ruler of the stage. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she performed England. The woman was a political genius, fashion icon, and professional enigma who could also shred on the lute and kill it on the virginals, a fancy harpsichord, not a lost medieval girl group. In a time when women were expected to embroider and stay quiet, Elizabeth was over here composing songs, dancing like a courtier on Red Bull, and casually reshaping the future of England. Music wasn't just a hobby for Elizabeth, it was part of her propaganda machine. She used it to dazzle foreign ambassadors, charm her court, and reinforce the image of the ethereal, untouchable Virgin Queen. Every note she played was another stitch in the myth of Gloriana. She even used musical performances as a flex. Imagine outplaying a diplomat on the virginals while also negotiating trade with his terrified soul. Her musical skill was just one part of the performance. The real instrument she mastered? Power. And she played that one better than anyone before or after her. But Elizabeth wasn't the only tutor who knew their way around a court, and by court, we mean tennis. Henry VIII, the king of swing and swords. Before Henry VIII was known for beheadings, annulments, and inventing his own church to escape a bad Tinder match, he was basically a royal athlete. Jousting, hunting, archery, wrestling, you name it, he did it. But tennis? Tennis was his jam. And not the lawn kind. We're talking real tennis, a medieval blood sport that was like racquetball meets ego warfare. Henry was good too. Like, maybe don't let the king win or he'll behead you. Good. The man had custom-built tennis courts at his palaces and allegedly strutted around in embroidered athletic gear. He was essentially the 16th century love child of LeBron James and a Tudor warlord. But as he aged and expanded horizontally, he had to hang up the racket. Still, his athletic prime remains a fascinating footnote in a reign best remembered for destroying monasteries and chopping off wives. Behind the towering figure in the Holbein portrait was once a jock with a mean forehand. From sports to spaniels, our next king wasn't known for his athleticism but for his pack of pampered dogs who had more access to Parliament than most people. Charles II. Long live the Dogfather. Charles II didn't walk into rooms. He strolled in, trailed by a troop of pampered, floppy-eared dogs like he was starring in a canine perfume commercial. His favorite breed? The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Named after him, because of course it was. These dogs weren't just pets, they were court insiders, with better perks than most nobles. Charles loved his spaniels so much that he passed a literal law allowing them to roam freely in any public building. Yes, royal dogs were legally allowed in Parliament. Picture it. Debates on trade and warfare, while fluffy spaniels napped under the benches. It's both adorable and entirely on brand for a monarch whose reign was essentially Restoration-era reality, television. While other kings waged wars or reformed governments, Charles invested his energy in leisure, style, and dog cuddles. He was witty, charming, scandalous, and totally uninterested in pretending to be anything else. If Charles had Instagram, it would have been half royal portraits, half dog selfies. But the next monarch on our list had a very different kind of ink on his skin, not from legislation, but from the tip of a sailor's needle. William IV, the tattooed Sailor King. Before he was king, William IV lived the kind of life most monarchs wouldn't dare imagine, namely, one involving actual work. As a teenager, he served in the Royal Navy, scrubbing decks, enduring storms, and most shockingly of all, earning respect. It was this seafaring stint that earned him the nickname, the Sailor King. And as a souvenir, a tattoo? Yes, the King of England was inked. Details about the tattoo are sketchy, because it's hard to get good records when everyone's wearing frock coats, but what's certain is that William was the first British monarch to sport body art. Long before tattoos were trendy, William was already rocking one like a Georgian-era pirate with a crown. His time in the Navy made him practical, blunt, and oddly likable for a royal. He swore, he rambled, he got into political brawls and occasionally governed. While most monarchs ascended the throne by birthright and paperwork, William arrived with sea legs and a scandalous past. But if sailing across oceans wasn't enough to give you palpitations, try boarding the first moving metal box on rails with a queen inside it gripping the seat in horror. Queen Victoria. First class panic on the Royal Express. Queen Victoria. Short, stern, and suddenly speeding through the countryside at a terrifying 30 miles per hour. When she became the first monarch to ride a train in 1842, she wasn't thrilled. In fact, she was absolutely terrified. Trains, after all, were loud, fast, and very new. And if there's one thing monarchs dislike, it's new things that could explode while dragging them across the landscape. But duty called, and Victoria boarded the royal train in a state of royal dread. To calm her nerves, they slowed the engine to a gentle 25 miles per hour, because apparently even technological revolution had to kneel to queenly anxiety. Still, once she realized she wasn't about to be launched into orbit, she actually grew fond of it. This one small journey marked a massive shift. Monarchy was now on board with modernity, quite literally, and so began Victoria's unlikely love affair with trains. The same woman who hated noise and change would go on to champion the industrial age. Irony, thy name is Victoria. But enough about locomotives, let's talk about the king who trolled his own guards by inventing a haunted tree. Yes, really. George III? Practical joker, farmer, ghost whisperer? Most people remember George III as the king who lost America, or the one who talked to trees during bouts of illness. But fewer know about his underappreciated side gig, full-time prankster. One of his favorite stunts? Convincing his guards that a tree on the palace grounds was haunted. And not just haunted, cursed, mysterious, and probably whispering royal secrets at night. Imagine being a palace guard, doing your boring night shift, and suddenly your monarch tells you the oak you're leaning against is possessed. Then he walks away, probably humming a tune, leaving you with your sanity slowly unraveling in the moonlight. That's peak George. Beyond ghost trees, George III was full of surprises. He was obsessed with farming, earning him the nickname Farmer George. He championed agricultural innovation and once personally oversaw experiments in crop rotation. One minute he's waving a royal scepter, the next he's judging your carrot yield. But behind the jokes and plows was a man battling immense personal struggles, which would tragically define his later years. Still, his quirks left a mark both historical and horticultural. Now let's pivot to another misunderstood royal. The king buried under a parking lot, who also happened to be a hardcore bookworm. Richard III, buried in a parking lot, surrounded by books. Richard III may have ended up beneath a car park in Leicester, but don't let the final resting spot fool you this guy was refined. Yes, the same king immortalized by Shakespeare as a hunchbacked villain was, in reality, a hardcore bibliophile. While his enemies were sharpening swords, Richard was building one of the most impressive personal libraries of his time. He read Latin, French, English, you name it. His collection included works on history, law, religion, and even philosophy. Richard wasn't just flipping through holy texts for brownie points. He genuinely devoured knowledge. In a world where literacy was a flex, Richard was out here turning pages faster than nobles turned allegiances. This unexpected side of Richard complicates the villain image. Was he ambitious? Sure. Ruthless? Probably. But he wasn't the snarling, one-dimensional sociopath of Elizabethan propaganda. He was more like a tragic overachiever who couldn't stop reading Machiavelli long enough to notice he was surrounded by enemies. But if you think an intellectual king is a surprise, wait until you meet the one who built castles and blueprints. That's right time to grab your hard hat for Edward I. Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, Master of Castles. They called him the Hammer of the Scots. But Edward, I could have easily been nicknamed the Blueprint Bastard. This towering medieval titan didn't just fight wars, he designed fortresses with the precision of a civil engineer on too much mead. While other kings left war to the generals, Edward rolled up his sleeves and helped draft castle plans. And these weren't cozy little stone piles. These were fortresses, power statements chiseled into mountains. Think Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, all strategically placed, structurally genius, and terrifyingly symmetrical. Edward wanted his enemies to know, I built this with both malice and math. The man wasn't just building castles, he was building a message. Every turret screamed domination. Every moat said, try me. And every stone served as a very permanent reminder that England was under new, architecturally gifted management. Of course, behind the walls and battle cries was a man obsessed with control. Whether that control came through conquest or construction, that was just detail. And speaking of obsessions, our next king loved falcons so much, it's a miracle he didn't fly off with them. Henry V, the Falcon Whisperer of Agincourt. Before he was the warrior poet who thrashed the French at Agincourt, Henry V was just a guy with an expensive bird hobby. Falcons, hawks, eagles, if it had feathers and looked majestic while tearing rodents to pieces, Henry probably named it something dramatic and fed it by hand. He didn't just dabble in falconry, he dominated it. Medieval falconry wasn't just about birds, it was status, a kind of airborne flex. But Henry took it seriously. These weren't pets, they were teammates, trained hunters, warbirds with talons and attitude. One chronicler even noted how Henry had a magnificent collection of raptors, each treated with more care than most nobles in his court. It fits, really. Falconry requires patience, strategy, and a cold, laser-focused stare, all things Henry brought to his military campaigns. Agincourt wasn't just won with arrows. It was won by a man who understood timing, terrain, and silent death from above. Still, for all his bird-whispering brilliance, Henry's heir had less interest in war and more interest in witches. James I, the witch, hunting wordsmith. James, I didn't just believe in witches, he wrote the manual. Long before the Salem witch trials lit up New England, James was already on his witchcraft grind, pouring royal energy into a little bedtime story called Daemonology. It's a breezy 3-book treatise on how to spot, try, and execute witches. Because nothing says good governance like making sure your citizens know how to burn their neighbors properly. To James, witchcraft wasn't spooky fun, it was a real, satanic threat to the crown. His obsession started after a stormy sea voyage that he blamed on dark magic, logical, obviously. He doubled down from there, sponsoring witch hunts and trials that ranged from absurd to horrific. Basically, if your cat looked at James funny, you were toast. But don't let the paranoia fool you. James was also a patron of the arts and a surprisingly intelligent man. He commissioned the King James Bible, a literary flex so big, people are still quoting it in arguments about everything from tattoos to brunch. So yes, the man who believed in witches also gave us one of the most influential texts in English history. Balance, baby. Speaking of balance, our next royal was all about blood and embroidery. Mary I. Bloody Mary with a needlepoint side hustle. You know her as Bloody Mary, the queen whose reign was soaked in Protestant blood and whose legacy lingers in every haunted mirror game. But behind the executions and burning pyres was a surprisingly talented needlewoman. Yes, while heretics went up in flames, Mary, I was threading silk into intricate tapestries. It's the kind of historical duality that makes you blink twice. Mary didn't just stitch for fun. She made her own clothes and created elaborate embroideries with themes of faith, royalty, and because she's Mary, probably a subtle death threat or two. Her skill with the needle was renowned. Even her enemies had to admit her talent. It's oddly poetic. The woman whose reign was defined by fire and fear also found comfort in delicate cloth and quiet stitching. While others played politics with swords, Mary wielded both scepter and spindle. A multitasker with a martyr complex. Of course, all that piety came from somewhere. Specifically from a royal ancestor who wouldn't even wear a proper crown, Edward the Confessor. The flower-crowned king. Edward the Confessor wasn't just holy, he was practically allergic to opulence. This was a man so committed to humility that he refused to wear a traditional crown. Instead, he rocked a circlet made of flowers. Literal flowers. Like a medieval Coachella attendee who accidentally wandered onto a throne. Edward's reign was a strange blend of spiritual devotion and political chaos. He was more monk than monarch, spending hours in prayer, avoiding war, and generally trying not to get involved. Which, in 11th century England, is a bit like trying to stay dry in a thunderstorm by standing still. But don't mistake his gentleness for weakness. Edward's cult of personality endured long after his death. He was canonized a saint, and his shrine became a pilgrimage hotspot. People weren't just honoring the king, they were honoring the idea that you could rule with grace, not just grit. And yet, while Edward was composing prayers and weaving daisy chains, our next king was waging war with pawns and bishops. Not in a cathedral, on a chessboard. William the Conqueror, checkmate, before breakfast. William the Conqueror had a lot on his plate invading England, subduing nobles, inventing bureaucracy, but he still made time for a game of chess. And not just for leisure. William was obsessed. In an era where games were either blood sports or drunken dice, chess was the cerebral king, maker's choice. Naturally, William crushed it. His affinity for chess wasn't just entertainment, it was an extension of his entire personality. The game was about domination, strategy, sacrifice, and surprise attacks. Sound familiar? The man literally played England like a chessboard. First, he outmaneuvered Harold. Then, he used castles like bishops to pin the Saxons. And finally, he crowned himself like a smug, power-hungry kingpiece. Chess was more than pastime. It was preparation. A mental war zone where he sharpened the same skills he'd later use on actual battlefields. And yes, he reportedly got very angry when he lost, so imagine being the poor courtier who dared to take his rook. But William's love for strategy wasn't limited to games. His son, however, he took losing to a whole new level at sea, in a shipwreck and with the entire line of succession on board. Henry II versus Thomas Becket. The chess feud that got bloody. Henry II was clever, volatile, and always about 5 moves ahead, unless that move involved picking friends. Case in point, Thomas Becket. Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting loyalty. Instead, Becket found religion faster than a monk on caffeine and started opposing Henry at every turn. And somehow, it all started over a game of chess. Legend has it the two had an explosive row while playing, and things spiraled from there like if a petty board game argument ended with murder in a cathedral. Their feud became one of history's most dramatic falling outs. Political, personal, and spiritual lines were crossed until Henry, in a fit of frustration, supposedly muttered, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard that and said, "Bet," then immediately rode off to hack Becket to death at the altar. Not great optics. This deadly chess match ended with Becket becoming a martyr and Henry doing public penance in sackcloth while being whipped by monks. Yes, whipped by monks. It was a rough PR week. But if you think that's tragic, just wait until we meet Henry's son, whose death set England on fire, literally and politically. Stephen, the Archer King in a kingdom on fire. Stephen of Blois wasn't supposed to be king, but when Henry I's only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in a shipwreck, more on that next, Stephen stepped up and said, "Well, somebody's got to wear the crown." What followed was nearly 2 decades of glorious chaos, known as the Anarchy. Think of it as England's least productive family feud, only with more swordplay and fewer casseroles. But amid all the power-grabbing and bloodshed, Stephen was known for one oddly wholesome trait. He was an exceptional archer and absolutely loved hunting. While civil war raged and barons burned down villages, Stephen was probably out in the woods taking aim at deer and forgetting to send troops. He wasn't a bad man, just wildly underqualified for the non-stop crisis that was medieval England. His reign was marked by shaky alliances, shifting loyalties, and every noble with a sword trying to start their own mini-kingdom. And yet, people still liked him. Maybe it was the charisma. Maybe it was the bow skills. Maybe it was just pity. Either way, his accidental rise to the throne was made possible by a tragic shipwreck that reshaped England's destiny, and that, dear viewer, is where we turn next. William Adelin, the prince who sank the crown. William Adelin was Henry I's only legitimate son, and more importantly, the only solid plan England had for avoiding chaos. Young, wealthy, politically connected, he was the medieval version of a LinkedIn golden child. Until, in 1120, he boarded the White Ship with a gaggle of nobles, too much wine, and not enough common sense. Spoiler alert, the ship sank hard. The White Ship disaster was one of the greatest maritime faceplants in British history. Over 300 people drowned, including almost the entire next generation of the Anglo-Norman elite. William allegedly had a chance to escape, but turned back to rescue his sister. Noble? Yes. Fatal? Also, yes. With his death, England's line of succession crumbled like a biscuit in hot tea. What followed was nearly 20 years of civil war known as the Anarchy, because apparently the term mild inconvenience didn't apply when every baron decided they deserved a crown. So while William never ruled a day in his life, his absence ruled years of English misery. Still, some kings tried to clean up the mess. Enter Henry III, who chose to fix England not with swords but with stone and stained glass. Henry III, builder of faith, king of blueprints. Henry III wasn't the most powerful, the most ruthless, or the most charismatic king to sit on England's throne. But if you've ever visited Westminster Abbey and gasped like a Victorian fainting into a lace handkerchief, that's his legacy. This guy didn't just love architecture, he weaponized it. While other monarchs waged war to prove dominance, Henry wielded Gothic arches. He launched a massive rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, transforming it into the architectural equivalent of a medieval mic drop. Vaulted ceilings? Check. Stained glass? Glorious. Jesus, looking dramatically radiant above the altar? You better believe it. Henry saw the church not just as a place of worship, but as a living billboard for divine right. Every stone screamed, God picked me to rule, and also I have impeccable taste. He poured money into artists, craftsmen, and imported design trends, like he was running a royal Etsy. And while he wasn't the strongest ruler politically, Henry knew how to leave an impression. His reign may have wobbled, but his buildings stood tall. And speaking of standing tall, our next monarch's coronation involved a sacred Scottish rock, a whole lot of tension, and the start of a very petty feud. Edward I, the Stone of Sconeswipe. Edward I, already infamous for stomping on Scotland with iron boots, decided that invading wasn't enough. No, he had to steal their national rock. Enter the Stone of Scone, a sacred slab used in Scottish coronations for centuries. Edward waltzed into Scotland in 1296, took the stone, and hauled it back to Westminster like a smug medieval raccoon with a shiny object. He had it installed beneath the English coronation chair just to make sure every future English monarch would symbolically sit on Scottish pride. Subtle, right? Edward didn't just conquer with swords, he conquered with symbolism. He knew the psychological warfare of turning Scotland's most revered object into royal butt support, and thus the Stone of Scone became both a literal and metaphorical pain in Scotland's national posterior. The act wasn't just petty, it was power politics in limestone. Edward's message was clear: I own you, even your rocks. It worked to a degree, but it also planted the seeds for centuries of resentment and rebellion. Still, while Edward played rock thief, his grandson would go on to play tournament king, jousting his way into hearts and, occasionally, hospital beds. Edward III, jousting king of the chivalry Olympics. Edward III didn't just enjoy tournaments, he turned them into medieval Coachella. This was a king who treated jousting like an Olympic sport, a political flex, and a full-on fashion show, all rolled into one. Chainmail? Custom? Horses? Armored? Speeches before mounting? Probably rehearsed. His passion for tournaments wasn't just about the thrill. It was a carefully crafted PR campaign of chivalry, grandeur, and, please don't rebel, I look awesome. He even founded the Order of the Garter, England's oldest and most elite chivalric order, which sounds like a group of enchanted laundry accessories, but was actually a tight club of knightly bromance. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about image. Tournaments were theater, and Edward was the showrunner. And boy, did he know how to stage a spectacle. Jousts, melees, feasts, fireworks, banners flapping dramatically in the wind. It was like Game of Thrones if nobody ever died and everyone looked fabulous. He made being a knight cool again. But while Edward armored up for tournaments, his successor preferred a different kind of dress code, something more glittery. Richard II, the first fashion influencer. Richard II didn't rule England so much as he accessorized it. While other kings wore crowns, Richard wore statements. Robes lined with gold thread, shoes with curled toes long enough to trip over, and tunics so bedazzled they could cause solar flares. This was the monarch who treated the throne like a runway. He spent extravagantly on clothes, jewels, and personal grooming. He rebranded monarchy as something divine and untouchable. His outfits? Designed to dazzle, confuse, and silence any rebellious murmurs with sheer fabric overwhelm. Think Louis XIV vibes, with a British drizzle of gloom. His love of fashion wasn't just vanity, it was power. He believed that looking godlike made people treat you like one. Unfortunately, he also believed that ruling like a god meant ignoring Parliament, overtaxing nobles, and trusting flatterers with the depth of a puddle. Eventually, the nobles got tired of being outshone and overruled. Richard's reign ended not in a wardrobe malfunction, but in deposition and a mysterious death. But hey, the man never had a bad outfit day. No, let's swap the eyeliner for a lute, because our next king wrote love songs while plotting rebellions. Henry IV, courtly love and rebel blood. Before he was king, Henry IV had already lived multiple lives: lord, exile, rebel, usurper. But amidst all the chaos, he made time for poetry. Yes, the future crown snatcher was a sucker for courtly love and knew his way around a lute. He could fight, yes, but he could also serenade. A knight in shining armor with a playlist of self-penned sad bangers. Henry was known for his appreciation of music and romantic verse. While others composed with swords, he preferred a good metaphor and maybe a soft sigh under the moonlight. It's a little ironic, really. The man who violently deposed his cousin Richard II also wrote lyrics about longing and loyalty. A little on the nose, Henry. But poetry aside, his reign was anything but peaceful. Plagued by rebellions, illness, and guilt, he struggled under the weight of a crown he had literally stolen. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the poetry hit so hard. His son, though? That guy would trade the love songs for battle hymns and marry a woman whose beauty sparked a dynasty. Catherine of Valois, the French bride who changed the game. Catherine of Valois wasn't just a royal bride, she was the medieval equivalent of a political grenade. As the daughter of the French king, she was handed over to Henry V like a diplomatic offering with great cheekbones. Their marriage, sealed after the Treaty of Troyes, was supposed to unite the two biggest rivals in Europe. Spoiler, it didn't, but it did produce a son who'd wear both crowns at least briefly and launch a family tree that would dominate the throne for generations. Catherine was renowned for her beauty, intelligence, and ability to navigate the backstabbing hall of mirrors that was medieval court life. But her story didn't end when Henry V died young, leaving her a widowed queen. Nope, Catherine got spicy. She secretly married, or maybe didn't, we're still not sure, a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. Together, they had kids. And one of those kids became the grandfather of Henry VII. That's right, Catherine accidentally created the Tudor dynasty. One moment she's mourning the warrior king. The next, she's founding an entire royal bloodline through a romantic subplot. But while Catherine managed to hold it together, her daughter-in-law Margaret of Anjou was ready to hold a sword. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of Fire and Fury. Margaret of Anjou was not here to be the quiet, supportive medieval wife. She was here to fight, literally. When her husband, Henry VI, melted into a puddle of passive religiosity, Margaret picked up the slack and sometimes the sword. Fiercely loyal to Henry, she ran the Lancastrian side of the Wars of the Roses like a general with a grudge. Margaret didn't just manage the court. She led armies, made alliances, and survived multiple exiles with the stubborn force of a woman who refused to let her dim-witted husband lose the throne without a brawl. She negotiated with foreign kings, defied English nobles, and inspired such fear that people whispered about her in the same tone they used for plagues. Her temper was legendary, her political instincts razor-sharp, and her dedication absolute. Margaret might have been born into royalty, but she fought like a commoner with nothing to lose. Her life was a Shakespearean drama, long before Shakespeare got around to writing it. But if you think Margaret made waves, wait until you meet the commoner who married her way straight into royal scandal. Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner who stole the crown. Elizabeth Woodville didn't come from royal blood. She came from nowhere, well, technically a noble but very minor background, and somehow ended up Queen of England. How? Love story, baby. Or power play. Or both. In one of the juiciest royal plot twists of the 15th century, King Edward IV secretly married her. No courtship, no political match, just surprise. Here's your new queen, everybody. She's hot. The court lost its collective mind. Nobles fumed. Diplomats stared. She wasn't even foreign. Elizabeth was English, and worse, a widow from the losing side of a civil war. Her marriage to Edward upended alliances, enraged his advisors, and turned royal matchmaking into a complete circus. But Elizabeth wasn't just some pretty face. She maneuvered her family into positions of power, elevated the Woodvilles into serious players, and protected her children with cold, calculated brilliance. Of course, this rise came with enemies. Her sons would become the tragic princes in the tower. Her family would be torn apart, and her legacy forever tangled in mystery and myth. Still, from commoner to queen, Elizabeth rewrote the script and set the stage for the last king to fall in battle, and the chaos that followed. Anne Neville, queen in the shadow of a war zone. Anne Neville was born into war and married into legend. Twice, her life reads like a tragic ballad sung in a burning castle. First, she was married to Edward of Westminster, the heir to the Lancastrian throne who promptly died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Anne barely had time to mourn before she found herself married again, this time to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, better known to history as Richard III. Their marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Anne and Richard united two powerful Yorkist houses, and when Richard took the crown, Anne became queen. But if you're expecting a fairy tale ending, think again. Anne's life at court was steeped in loss, illness, and whispers. She lost her only son young, and rumors swirled that Richard poisoned her when she became sick. No proof, of course, just the usual medieval blend of suspicion and misogyny. Still, through it all, Anne was a loyal partner in Richard's rise to power. Her queenship may have been short-lived, but her legacy endures quiet, tragic, overshadowed by kings, but never erased. Speaking of tragic rises, let's look at the man who ended a war, built a dynasty, and counted pennies while doing it. Henry VII, the accountant king with a crown. Henry VII was not flashy. He wasn't charming. He didn't win battles with flair or speeches. But he won, big time. The man ended the Wars of the Roses, snatched the crown from Richard III's broken body at Bosworth, and founded the Tudor dynasty. That's resume gold. But more than a warrior, Henry was a bean counter. He ran England like a nervous startup CEO who triple checks every invoice. He knew the crown's weakness wasn't rebellion, it was bankruptcy. So he tightened the royal purse strings until they squeaked. He fined nobles for everything, including breathing too confidently, and used financial trickery to keep his rivals poor and powerless. He was shrewd, paranoid, and relentlessly focused on security. Through strategic marriages, tax collection, and quietly crushing threats, Henry amassed one of the largest royal fortunes in English history. The Tudor Rose? His invention. A clever PR mashup to signal peace and unity, while he quietly prepared for anyone dumb enough to test him. Still, behind the accounting spreadsheets and strategic smiles, Henry laid the groundwork for England's golden age. And he passed the torch to a son who was less into spreadsheets and more into wives. Anne Boleyn, the queen who broke the church. Anne Boleyn wasn't just a queen, she was a wrecking ball in a French hood. Witty, sharp, and utterly captivating, Anne didn't just catch Henry VIII's eye, she hooked it, reeled it in, and slapped the Pope across the face with it. Because of her, England broke from Rome. Not because she asked him to. Because he wanted her so badly, he invented an entire new branch of Christianity just to make her his legal wife. That's power. Anne wasn't the typical court beauty. She wasn't blonde or demure. She had dark features, sharp intelligence, and a tongue that could either seduce or skewer. She played hard to get because she had to. Sleeping with the king without a ring meant becoming a footnote, but marrying him, that made her a queen and a legend. Of course, the court is a cruel stage. Anne gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Gloriana, but no son. Whispers turned to roars. Her enemies circled. She was accused of adultery, incest, witchcraft, basically everything except bad fashion. She was beheaded in 1536, and Henry moved on. But Anne, she changed history, and her ghost never quite left the palace halls or Henry's memory. Next up, the quiet one. The one who gave him what no other wife could. Jane Seymour, the quiet queen who delivered a dynasty. Jane Seymour didn't have Anne Boleyn's fire, Catherine of Aragon's defiance, or Henry's other wives' knack for drama. What she had was timing and a uterus that delivered. Quiet, modest, and demure to the point of invisibility, Jane arrived on the scene just as Henry VIII's appetite for chaos peaked. And unlike Anne, Jane didn't tease or argue. She curtsied, she smiled, and she agreed. That strategy worked wonders. Within a year of Anne Boleyn's head hitting the basket, Jane was married to the king. Her main mission? Give him a son. Mission accomplished. In 1537, she gave birth to Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir that Henry had practically rearranged the cosmos to get. The country rejoiced. Henry wept. Jane, tragically, died from postnatal complications just days later. She was the only one of Henry's 6 wives to be buried beside him, a morbid honor, considering his track record. Jane is often seen as the ideal Tudor queen, submissive, fertile, and conveniently deceased. But her impact was seismic. She gave the dynasty what it needed most: survival. Next in line, the queen whose royal Tinder date left Henry swiping nope so hard he annulled the entire marriage. Anne of Cleves, the queen who walked away with a pension. Anne of Cleves was supposed to be wife number 4, a German princess with a politically convenient passport and a face that, according to Henry VIII, looked better in portraits. Famously, when Henry met her in person, he recoiled so hard he nearly invented modern ghosting. "I like her not," he declared loudly, rudely, and with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Poor Anne didn't stand a chance. The marriage was never consummated, thank God for her. And after just 6 months, it was annulled on the grounds of non-consumption and mutual weirdness. But here's where Anne pulled the ultimate power move. Instead of fighting it, she agreed, gracefully. And in return, she walked away with a generous settlement, several houses, and the honorary title of King's beloved sister. She lived a long, comfortable life, became besties with Henry's daughters, and never once had to worry about being beheaded. In the Game of Thrones that was Henry's love life, Anne of Cleves was the rare woman who exited with dignity, wealth, and her neck intact. Not something his next wife could say, because next came Catherine Howard, the teenager, the flirt, the tragedy. Catherine Howard, too young, too fast, too dead. Catherine Howard was everything Henry VIII shouldn't have married. Young, impulsive, flirtatious, and about 30 years his junior, she was catapulted to queenship like a teenage star into a political horror film. She was also Anne Boleyn's cousin, because apparently Henry had a type, and that type was doomed. At first, Catherine brought joy to the aging king. She was vivacious, energetic, and didn't openly recoil from his ulcerated leg. But youth comes with secrets, and Catherine had a few, namely, premarital flirtations that turned into post-marital scandals. When rumors started flying, the court went full CSI, Tudor. Love letters were uncovered, testimonies tortured out, and soon, Catherine was being marched to the Tower. She was only around 19 when she was executed. Her alleged last words? A heartbreaking mix of regret and innocence. Catherine wasn't a villain, she was a teenager trapped in a power structure that chewed women up for sport. Her fall was swift, brutal, and tragic. But Henry still wasn't done. He had one more wife to go, and this time he didn't want passion, he wanted survival. Enter the final queen, Catherine Parr. The nurse, the scholar, the survivor. Catherine Parr, the wife who lived. Catherine Parr wasn't Henry VIII's first choice, but she was his last, and that's what mattered. By the time they married in 1543, Henry was bloated, irritable, and more ulcer than man. What he needed wasn't romance. He needed triage. Catherine was more nurse than bride, tending to his festering wounds, keeping his ego intact, and dodging political death traps like a Tudor Florence Nightingale. But don't mistake her caregiving for passivity. Catherine was smart. A published author, a religious reformer, a politically savvy operator who managed to survive the Tudor court with her head firmly attached. She even got into theological debates with Henry, which, in retrospect, sounds suicidal. When his advisors tried to have her arrested for her Protestant leanings, she spun a flawless 180, playing the, "Oh, I was just trying to entertain you, dear" card. Henry bought it. She lived. After Henry's death, Catherine remarried for love, this time to Thomas Seymour. It ended in heartbreak and scandal, but she finally got to choose her own life. In a world where queens were either crowned or executed, Catherine Parr did something revolutionary. She survived. Her stepson, however, he didn't get that luxury. Edward VI was brilliant, but frail. Edward VI, the boy king with a scholar's brain. Edward VI inherited the throne at just 9 years old. A sickly child with the mind of a theologian and the body of someone who clearly didn't drink enough medieval smoothies, he was Henry VIII's long-awaited male heir, the crown jewel of a generation of marital drama. But he wasn't a puppet. Edward was deeply devout, fiercely Protestant, and ready to remake England in his own image, even if that image had to be sketched between coughing fits. Under his rule, or rather under his advisor's rule, England sprinted further from Catholicism. Masses were simplified, altars stripped, and churches whitewashed. Edward supported it all. He read the scriptures in Latin and Greek, wrote theological essays for fun, and had a pen sharper than any courtier's sword. But the crown weighed heavily. His health was a slow-motion tragedy, and by 15, it was clear the boy king wasn't going to see adulthood. He tried to alter the succession to keep England Protestant, bypassing his Catholic half-sister Mary. It didn't work. And that brings us to Mary I, Catholic, uncompromising, and absolutely done with all this Protestant nonsense. Philip II of Spain, husband, stranger, political grenade. When Mary I married Philip II of Spain, it was supposed to be a match made in Catholic heaven. Instead, it was a diplomatic disaster disguised as a wedding. Philip Spain's golden boy was everything Mary wanted. Devout, powerful, and staunchly Catholic. But he was also foreign, aloof, and about as emotionally available as a brick wall. England hated him on sight. Parliament panicked. People muttered about Spanish domination, and Mary, already unpopular for her burning tendencies, found herself even more isolated. Philip barely spoke English and showed little interest in ruling with her. He spent as much time as possible in Spain, making occasional husbandly cameos before jetting off again medieval ghosting, royal edition. Their marriage did bring some political perks, alliances, military support, the occasional awkward banquet, but it was deeply unpopular with the English people. They feared a Catholic takeover, a Spanish heir, and a return to continental entanglements. Mary loved Philip. Philip tolerated Mary. The country barely tolerated either of them, and when she died childless, so did the dream of a Catholic Tudor heir. which is when her half-sister Elizabeth stepped in single, stylish, and ready to dance England into a new era. Literally, Elizabeth I, the dancing queen of the Virgin Court. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she performed it. Every gesture, every gown, every carefully choreographed dance step was part of a masterclass in power projection. She was a queen with rhythm, and she knew it. Her court wasn't just about politics and poetry. It was a 16th century disco with Latin lyrics, and Elizabeth, she was always center stage. She loved dancing, not just casual little jigs either. We're talking full-on Renaissance ballets with perfect posture, embroidered sleeves, and dramatic footwork. She trained like a professional and danced like it mattered, because for her, it did. Grace was power. Poise was control. To stumble in public was to crack the myth of Gloriana. Even foreign diplomats were dazzled. They'd arrive expecting a stiff monarch and leave mumbling about her galliard footwork. She could disarm political tensions with a curtsy and leave rivals out of breath on the parquet. It was political theater, elegant, relentless, and always under control. But behind the glamour was always the question of marriage, heirs, and legacy. And while she danced around suitors, her brother-in-law's ghost loomed large. Which brings us to the Queen, with a taste for art, masks, and expensive foreign drama, Anne of Denmark, the party planner of the Stuart court. Anne of Denmark wasn't content with being queen consort to James I. She wanted a stage, and so she turned the English court into a glittering, velvet-drenched festival of drama, masks, and extravagance. If there was a courtier who could prance through allegory while delivering symbolic verse about moonlight and destiny, Anne had already cast them. She adored the arts not in a vague, patronizing way, but with full, dramatic flair. Anne personally acted in masks, hired the best set designers and costume creators, and turned banquets into theatrical showcases. These weren't dinner parties, they were Instagram stories with live unicorns and metaphors about royal virtue. Her influence transformed Jacobean culture. She was a muse to artists and a thorn in the side of Puritans who thought the court had become a Renaissance rave. And when she wasn't throwing symbolic ragers, she was navigating palace intrigue, religious tensions, and a marriage to a king who preferred books and boys to ballroom partners. Still, Anne made her mark not with speeches, but with satin and spectacle. And speaking of spectacle, her husband was building something even grander, an art collection that would make emperors weep. Charles I, collector-in-chief of the European greats. Before Charles, I lost his head. He nearly lost his mind over art. This was a king who collected masterpieces like they were rare Pokemon. Titian, Rubens, Van Dyck. His palace walls weren't just decorated, they were a full-blown Renaissance museum curated by someone with an eye for genius and a total lack of fiscal restraint. Charles wasn't just a patron, he was obsessed. His collection included hundreds of paintings, sculptures, and tapestries, many of which he acquired at suspicious speed from struggling European nobles. He would negotiate, charm, or simply throw royal cash at anything that looked remotely like divine beauty. But here's the twist. Charles had exquisite taste and zero political instinct. While he was arranging portraits and basking in classical grandeur, his kingdom was falling apart. Parliament was growing restless. The people were growing broke. And Charles? He was posing for Van Dyck with a smoldering stare that screamed, "I don't do taxes." Eventually, his love of divine order and absolute monarchy clashed headfirst with reality, and while his court glittered, the gallows loomed. Still, his legacy in art endures. His queen, however, left a different legacy, one that smells like bergamot and boiled leaves. Catherine of Braganza, the queen who brought tea to England. Catherine of Braganza might not have had much say in court. Politics, being a Portuguese Catholic queen married to Charles II wasn't exactly a recipe for influence, but she brought something arguably more important than policy: tea. Yes, that tea. The drink that would go on to define British culture, colonize breakfast tables, and inspire more drama than a season of royal biographies. Before Catherine, tea was a curious, exotic beverage, imported in small quantities by wealthy merchants. After Catherine, it was fashionable. It was royal. It was everywhere. She drank it regularly, served it at court, and soon every aristocrat was pretending to understand leaves in hot water while pretending to like each other. She also brought sugar, marmalade, and a whole Portuguese aesthetic to England's rather grey palate. And though her marriage to Charles II was childless and not exactly romantic thanks to his endless parade of mistresses, Catherine held her own with dignity. No beheadings, no public breakdowns, just tea, composure, and the quiet revolution of afternoon sipping. While Catherine introduced calm civility, the next royal was a chaos grenade, one who lost his throne not in battle, but in a bloodless family coup. James II, the Catholic king who blinked. James II had a dream: to be the first openly Catholic monarch in a Protestant England since Mary I, and to not get burned at the stake for it. Bold move. Problem was, the country wasn't ready, not even close. When James took the throne in 1685, he walked into a nation already allergic to papal influence and twitchy about royal absolutism. So what did he do? Exactly what you'd expect a tone-deaf king to do: double down. He appointed Catholics to high office. He suspended laws that kept Protestants safe. He ignored Parliament like it owed him money. And when his wife gave birth to a Catholic son, the country collectively freaked out, like someone had just poured wine on a powdered wig. In 1688, England executed its most polite coup ever. William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, was invited to invade. James fled. No war, no bloodbath, just a quiet retreat into exile, with a hint of embarrassment. It was called the Glorious Revolution, glorious for everyone except James. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before William started the world's chillest invasion, he was half of a co-monarchy that knew how to garden and govern: William III and Mary II. Co-monarchs, co-gardeners. William III and Mary II were the royal equivalent of a power couple with matching spades. They didn't just share the crown, they shared a passion for gardening. Yes, behind the Protestant realignment of the monarchy was a pair who loved tulips and topiary like most couples love vacation photos. After James II fled, Parliament offered the throne to his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William. Unprecedented. England had never seen a king and queen rule jointly by constitutional invitation. While they rearranged the balance of power in favor of Parliament, cheers from the nobles, they also rearranged the hedges, literally. William, especially, was obsessed with landscape design. At Hampton Court, he transformed the gardens into a Dutch Baroque masterpiece, with symmetry so sharp it could slice through political tension. While he plotted military campaigns against France, he also argued about gravel paths and rose alignments. Mary, for her part, was more reserved, but just as influential. Together, they stabilized a volatile kingdom and gave England its first truly modern constitutional monarchy, plus some very photogenic flower beds. Their reign may have been practical and polite, but the next queen? She was horse races, heartbreak, and a dynasty's last gasp. Queen Anne. Horse racing, heartbreak, and too many dead heirs. Queen Anne's reign was less of a fairy tale and more of a slow-burning tragedy with a side of saddle polish. The last of the Stuart monarchs, she ruled from 1702 to 1714 and left behind a legacy of war victories, parliamentary shifts, and 17 pregnancies. That's not a typo. 17. And not a single child survived to adulthood. It's a statistic so grim even Victorian novelists would say, that's a bit much. Despite her personal heartbreak, Anne found solace in horse racing, particularly the new Ascot Racecourse, which she helped found. When she wasn't governing or weeping into her royal tissues, she was placing bets on majestic animals running in circles. In fact, if there had been an award for most devoted monarch to thoroughbreds, Anne would have trotted away with the trophy. Politically, her reign saw the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain. Emotionally, she was isolated, racked with health problems, and haunted by the ghost of her own family line, which was vanishing faster than a losing racehorse. With her death came the end of the Stuarts. The next king was imported like a particularly confused German sausage, George I, the silent king who spoke zero English. George, I didn't want the English crown, but England didn't care. He was Protestant, vaguely royal, and most importantly, not Catholic. So in 1714, they shipped him over from Hanover like a royal Amazon order. One slight hiccup. He didn't speak English at all. Not even a polite good morning. This was a monarch who ruled through interpreters and preferred to speak in Latin with his ministers because it was less awkward than trying to learn the language of his own kingdom. It made for an awkward court. George would attend state functions with the same expression you'd wear at a party where you know no one and forgot your phone. He spent most of his time in his private apartments, or better yet, back in Hanover, where things at least made linguistic sense. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't even particularly interested, but he was stable, which England desperately needed after decades of dynastic chaos. And thus, the Georgian era began, with a king who wouldn't have understood a single one of his people's toasts. But his son? Oh, his son knew the language of music, loud, dramatic, Baroque music. George II, Handel's Hype, Man and the Last Battle King. George II was a walking contradiction, emotionally cold, perpetually irritable, and not exactly beloved, but he had taste, specifically in music. He was obsessed with George Friedrich Handel, the Baroque rock star of his time. George II didn't just commission works, he performed reactions. He famously stood during the Hallelujah chorus of Messiah, possibly because he was moved, possibly because he thought it was the end and wanted to leave. But his love for Handel was genuine. Under his reign, music flourished, with Handel producing operas, anthems, and royal fireworks that literally exploded over London. George's patronage helped shape the cultural soundscape of 18th century England, even if his political leadership was, well, kind of on mute. Yet, George II wasn't all opera and oratorios. He holds the distinction of being the last British monarch to personally lead troops in battle at Dettingen in 1743. Imagine your modern head of state donning armor and charging into enemy lines. Yeah, that happened. So while he might not have been the warmest royal on the throne, George II marched, music-ed, and managed his monarchy with a blend of stubborn grit and dramatic flair. His son? A farming fanatic with a crown and a compost pile. George III. Farmer George and the crown's compost king. George III is often remembered as the Mad King who lost America, which is a bit unfair considering he also revolutionized royal PR by becoming Britain's first real relatable monarch. How? He loved farming. Obsessively. The man wasn't just dabbling in gardening, he was out in the fields, inspecting manure like it was crown jewels. Dubbed Farmer George by a public that didn't quite know whether to mock or admire him, he turned Windsor into an agricultural experiment zone. He read farming manuals, kept prize livestock, and even attended sheep-shearing festivals with more enthusiasm than state banquets. Imagine your head of state getting genuinely excited about soil pH. That was George. But there was more to him than root vegetables. George III was diligent, moral, and deeply invested in the country's well-being. He was a walking rejection of the flashy, aloof monarch stereotype. Unfortunately, his later life was plagued by mental illness, episodes of confusion, paranoia, and emotional instability that were as misunderstood then as they are dramatized now. Still, while Parliament schemed and colonies rebelled, George planted wheat and worried about crop rotation. His son would go in a very different direction toward waistcoats, waistlines, and the world's most expensive taste. George IV, the Prince Regent of too much everything. George IV didn't believe in moderation. He believed in decadence. This was a man who treated monarchy like an endless Instagram reel of gourmet food, gold-plated rooms, and exotic art. As Prince Regent and later king, he turned extravagance into an Olympic event, with himself as the sole competitor and winner. His diet was legendary, mostly for being medically inadvisable. He drank like a fish with a grudge, ballooned in weight, and often had to be sewn into his trousers. Fashion? Flawless. Taste? Impeccable. Self-control? Non-existent. He built the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, a palace that looks like a Middle Eastern fever dream, just because he could. He was a patron of the arts, yes, but also a patron of gossip columns, court drama, and very public scandals. His feud with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was so ugly it played out in Parliament and on the streets, with citizens literally taking sides like it was a Regency soap opera. And yet, behind the fanfare and frills, he helped shape modern ceremonial monarchy. But his brother and successor? He went in a whole other direction, back to the high seas and into full sailor mode. William IV, the tattooed storyteller of the seven seas. Before he became king, William IV spent years in the Royal Navy, which meant his royal resume included things like swabbed decks, cursed storms, and maybe got a tattoo. He wasn't polished, he wasn't elegant, but he was real. And when he finally ascended the throne in his 60s, he brought a wave of bluntness and bizarre tales with him. William was known as the Sailor King, and he leaned into that branding like a man who still kept a compass in his pocket out of habit. He loved telling stories, most of which were probably exaggerated, and he had little patience for aristocratic pretense. Ministers found him unpredictable, often charming, and occasionally infuriating. He'd interrupt meetings with personal anecdotes, yell at Parliament like they were naughty midshipmen, and then pivot back to royal duties without missing a beat. His reign was brief but significant. He passed major reform acts, cut court expenses, and helped stabilize the monarchy after George IV's PR disasters. He didn't look like a king. He didn't act like a king. But somehow, it worked. And then came the Queen, who defined an entire era, revolutionized monarchy, and was absolutely terrified of trains. Queen Victoria, the Empress who feared the engine. Queen Victoria ruled over the largest empire in history, but ask her to board a train, and she turned into a nervous wreck. In 1842, when she became the first monarch to ride a train, she reportedly approached the journey like it might explode. Which, to be fair, in the early days of steam travel, wasn't an entirely irrational fear. They slowed the train to a cautious 25 miles per hour just to keep her from bolting off the platform. Every puff of steam probably felt like a royal assassination attempt, but to her credit, she did it. And eventually, she liked it so much so that the royal train became a symbol of modern monarchy, a plush, mobile throne room hurtling through the English countryside. Victoria's reign was a tangle of contradictions. She hated noise but ruled an industrial age. She was a private person made into a public myth. And while she was once a trembling passenger, she became the face of modernity. Her son would take that embrace of luxury even further. Edward VII didn't just ride the train, he practically turned it into a moving casino. Edward VII, the playboy prince turned diplomacy master. Before he was king, Edward VII spent nearly 60 years as the ultimate royal understudy. He filled the time with gambling, mistresses, and fashion so extravagant it made peacocks blush. Known affectionately and not so affectionately as Bertie, he turned indulgence into an art form. He dined lavishly, smoked cigars like a chimney with a title, and could ruin a waistcoat faster than a spilled creme brulee. And yet, when he finally ascended the throne in 1901, something surprising happened. He was good at it, really good. He used his charm and social connections to smooth international tensions, notably improving relations with France through what became known as the Entente Cordiale. That's right, he went from scandal magnet to diplomatic powerhouse, all while maintaining a wardrobe that could carpet a palace. Despite his reputation as a hedonist, Edward understood the power of soft diplomacy. He turned his talents for parties and flattery into geopolitical tools. A raised glass here, a whispered compliment there, and suddenly Britain had fewer enemies and better treaties. Still, when it came to hobbies, his son would choose something more stamp-sized. George V, the Stamp King with a steady hand. George V had no time for flair, no mistresses, no yacht parties, no masquerade balls, just stamps. Glorious, glorious stamps. He was a serious collector, one of the greatest philatelists in history, with a collection worth millions today. And while other monarchs posed dramatically or threw lavish feasts, George V was more likely found hunched over a tiny square of paper, muttering about watermark anomalies. But don't mistake his obsession for eccentricity. George V brought stability to the monarchy. His reign spanned World War I, the fall of multiple European empires, and the rebranding of the royal house from the very German-sounding Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the resolutely British Windsor. Imagine changing your last name mid-war to avoid getting called a foreigner, then going back to your stamps like nothing happened. He was calm, disciplined, and quietly beloved. His lack of flash was his brand. After decades of royal chaos, George V felt like a safe pair of gloved hands. But safety wasn't the vibe for his eldest son. Because the next king loved fashion, romance, and breaking the entire monarchy over a woman named Wallis. Edward VIII, the king who dressed sharp and abdicated hard. Edward VIII could have been the face of a modernized monarchy. Handsome, fashion-forward, and photogenic from every angle, he was basically the original influencer king before influencers were a thing. His suits were tailored, his hair was immaculate, and he could sell royal glamour with a single smirk. But behind the perfectly pleated trousers was a man wholly uninterested in playing the long game of kingship. Enter Wallis Simpson, American, twice, divorced, and definitely not what the Church of England had in mind for a queen. Edward didn't care. He fell hard and fast, and when Parliament and the establishment gave him the ultimatum Wallis or the crown, he chose love, or lust, or maybe just the thrill of being a contrarian with nice cufflinks. In 1936, he abdicated the throne after less than a year, triggering a constitutional crisis, a media frenzy, and one of the most dramatic mic drops in royal history. He became the Duke of Windsor and spent the rest of his life floating through socialite circles, occasionally making public statements that aged like unpasteurized milk. With Edward out, the monarchy needed a reboot. Enter his shy, stammering younger brother who had to learn how to lead a nation with a microphone and clenched fists. George VI, the king who found his voice. George VI never wanted to be king. He was the spare, the quiet one, the man who'd much rather sail a boat than command an empire. But when Edward VIII pieced out for romance and exile, George had no choice but to step up. Problem was, he had a debilitating stammer, a deep fear of public speaking, and a national crisis knocking at the door. What followed was one of the most inspiring royal transformations in history. With the help of a speech therapist, Lionel Logue, George battled his fear one syllable at a time. By the time World War II erupted, the once timid monarch was delivering steady, powerful broadcasts that reassured a rattled nation. George wasn't glamorous. He wasn't a natural leader, but he was reliable. While bombs fell on London, he refused to leave. He visited hospitals, factories, and troops. He connected with the people not through charisma but through sheer perseverance. His reign proved that monarchy could be human, fallible, and still essential. And when he died in 1952, the nation wept not just for a king, but for a man who earned the crown. His daughter would take it from there, and with her came a legacy of corgis and quiet power. Elizabeth II, Queen of Corgis and Constancy. Elizabeth II reigned for so long she became more than a monarch. She became an institution, a grandmother of the globe, and a walking relic of every historical event since the invention of color television. But beneath the tiaras and televised speeches lived a woman with a very specific obsession: corgis. They weren't just pets. They were companions, shadows, and sometimes fuzzy emotional support systems for a queen who shook hands with history daily. Her Majesty owned over 30 corgis during her reign, each with names like Monty, Whisper, or Susan, her first, and each given more attention than most junior royals. Elizabeth's public image was tightly managed, dignified, reserved, the eternal embodiment of duty. But those corgis hinted at something softer, quirky, loyal, and surprisingly funny. She reportedly fed them herself, let them roam the palace freely, and tolerated their occasional mischief with amused affection. Beyond the corgis, Elizabeth was a steady hand in decades of political upheaval. She navigated decolonization, royal scandals, and national tragedies with the emotional range of a granite statue, but always standing firm. And now, the crown rests on the head of her son, a man who spent decades waiting in the garden, quite literally, Charles III, the gardener king with a watering can and a vision. Charles III waited longer than any heir in British history. Decades of ribbon cuttings, royal protocol, and awkward press moments about pen malfunctions. But while he was waiting, he wasn't exactly idle. He was building his kingdom in the soil. Literally. Highgrove House, his private residence, became his horticultural sanctuary. And not just your average backyard tomato patch, we're talking wildflower meadows, organic farming, and philosophical topiary. Charles is obsessed with sustainability. Before it was cool or politically necessary, he was composting, championing heirloom vegetables, and ranting about architectural monstrosities with a passion usually reserved for football. His garden at Highgrove is less a royal luxury and more a living argument that nature and nobility can coexist without choking on pesticides. He's also a noted patron of the arts, founder of the Prince's Trust, and someone who genuinely seems to care sometimes too deeply, too publicly, too awkwardly. But that's Charles, complex, earnest, and finally king at a time when the monarchy itself is being re-examined. William the Conqueror, first king crowned at Westminster Abbey. William the Conqueror didn't just rewrite England's future in blood and bureaucracy, he also set the stage, quite literally, for royal tradition. His coronation in 1066 was the first ever to be held at Westminster Abbey. A practical choice? Definitely, but also a symbolic masterstroke. By choosing this iconic location, William wasn't just taking a throne, he was planting a flag in the soul of England. The coronation itself was pure medieval drama, tense, theatrical, and full of misunderstood yelling. According to chroniclers, when the crowd inside Westminster Abbey shouted their approval of William in both English and Norman French, the guards outside thought a riot had broken out and promptly set fire to nearby buildings. Because nothing says, "Long live the king," like arson. Still, the chaos didn't stop William from laying down a tradition that would endure for 1,000 years. Every English monarch since has followed in his soot-covered footsteps, crowned beneath the arches of Westminster Abbey. And speaking of tradition, the next king on our list upheld a very different one of eating so many eels he literally died from it. Henry I, death by fish addiction. Henry I was a savvy ruler, a polyglot, and a political power player. But none of that mattered when he met his doom not in battle, not by betrayal, but by lampreys. Yes, Henry loved lampreys, those slippery eel-like fish, so much that he ignored doctor's orders and devoured a massive helping during a trip to Normandy in 1135. That indulgent feast would be his last. The official cause of death? A surfeit of lampreys. Translation: the man overdosed on fish. Medieval food poisoning? Possibly. Divine punishment for gluttony? Some monks thought so. But either way, it was the most anticlimactic end to a king who once crushed rebellions and centralized royal justice. The aftermath of his lamprey binge was far from peaceful. With no legitimate male heir, remember, his son had drowned in the White Ship disaster. His death triggered a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. All because he couldn't resist some medieval seafood. So while Henry reformed England's legal system, he also proved one thing. No matter how powerful you are, no one is above the dangers of dinner. Next, we dive into one of the most formidable royal women in history, the mother of Richard the Lionheart and a queen in her own right, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who ruled more than kings. Before Richard the Lionheart ever drew a sword, his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine had already lived several lives more dramatic than most monarchs. She was a queen twice, first of France, then of England. She went on crusade dressed in armor, defied multiple kings, and governed vast territories in her own right. Oh, and she also happened to be one of the greatest patrons of the arts in medieval Europe. Eleanor wasn't just royalty, she was power. She inherited Aquitaine, one of the richest provinces in France, and her marriages to Louis VII and then Henry II turned her into medieval Europe's political linchpin. When Henry's reign soured, Eleanor staged a rebellion with her sons against him. She was imprisoned for over a decade and emerged more politically relevant than ever. You know, casual medieval queen behavior. She was fiercely intelligent, multilingual, and entirely unwilling to play the silent consort. Her court became the epicenter of culture, music, and poetry. She didn't just raise kings, she shaped them. And one of those kings? Her lion-hearted son, whose legacy would include not just battle glory, but a very unusual post-mortem souvenir. Eleanor of Castile, the queen who inspired stone, monuments of love. Eleanor of Castile wasn't the flashiest queen in England's history, but she inspired one of the most romantic architectural gestures in medieval Europe. When she died in 1290, her husband Edward I, yes, the Hammer of the Scots guy, was devastated. So what did he do? He ordered the construction of 12 lavish stone crosses, one for each place her funeral procession stopped on the way to Westminster Abbey. These weren't little roadside markers. These were Gothic masterpieces. Think Instagrammable grief with medieval budgets. The Eleanor crosses were towering symbols of royal mourning and, let's be honest, some serious guilt compensation, because Edward wasn't exactly easy to live with. But when she died, he made sure she was remembered in stone and sorrow. Eleanor herself was no passive figure. She managed royal estates, supported architectural projects, and bore 16 children. Her political influence, though quieter than others, was substantial. And the love Edward showed her in death, whether driven by devotion or remorse, became legendary. Still, while Eleanor was immortalized in cross-stone elegance, her royal inn, Law's youth, was far messier and filled with taverns, fights, and a redemption arc fit for the battlefield. Henry V, wild youth to warrior king. Before he was the hero of Agincourt and the star of Shakespeare's Henry V, Prince Hal was something of a delinquent. He partied hard, brawled harder, and hung out with the kind of people who made modern tabloid royalty look like monks. He was arrested at least once, reportedly stole wine from royal cellars, and allegedly punched a judge for sentencing one of his buddies. Basically, he was a medieval frat boy with a crown in the wings. Then, everything changed. When he became king in 1413, Henry switched from tavern fights to tactical brilliance overnight. It was the glow-up of the century. He crushed rebellions at home, restored royal prestige, and then set his sights on France. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 cemented his legend outnumbered, exhausted, knee-deep in mud, and still victorious. The longbow may have helped, but it was Henry's leadership that turned the tide. His reign was short but seismic. He united England under a warrior's banner, married the French king's daughter, and almost brought both crowns under one head. But while Henry conquered abroad, his son would try to conquer both thrones and succeed, if only briefly. Henry VI, the boy who became King of England and France. Henry VI had the most impressive royal resume you could ask for, on paper. King of England at 9 months old, and by age 10 also crowned King of France. 2 crowns, 1 toddler. Unfortunately, Henry's rule was less a tale of triumph and more a cautionary example of what happens when you hand 2 nations to a daydreamer. Deeply pious and chronically indecisive, Henry wasn't cut out for politics or war. He prayed more than he ruled and preferred monasteries over military camps, which would have been lovely if England wasn't bleeding money and men in the 100 Years' War. His claim to the French throne slowly crumbled, and his mental health deteriorated along with it. By his 20s, Henry had bouts of catatonia so severe he didn't respond for months. He also holds the dubious title of being the only English monarch to be crowned King of France, then lose both crowns in a national collapse that sparked the Wars of the Roses. His reign was less a golden age and more a slow-motion implosion. And while he drifted between thrones and cathedrals, his wife was making power moves worthy of any political chessboard. Richard III, the last king to die in battle. Richard III gets a bad rap. Shakespeare turned him into a snarling, humpbacked villain who'd murder his nephews for breakfast. But the real Richard? Complicated. Brutal, yes. Ambitious, absolutely. But also a competent leader, skilled soldier, and loyal brother, until politics turned everyone into enemies. He seized the throne in 1483, declaring his nephews illegitimate and locking them in the Tower of London. where they vanished into the pages of dark history. Whether Richard murdered them remains one of England's creepiest unsolved mysteries. What is known is that his 2-year reign was a frantic scramble to stabilize a fracturing kingdom. Richard wasn't soft. He passed progressive legal reforms and fought corruption, but he also had the charisma of a storm cloud and the PR of a fire drill. When Henry Tudor challenged him at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Richard didn't retreat. He charged headfirst into enemy lines, yelling "treason" and swinging his sword like a man possessed. He was the last English king to die in battle. His body vanished for centuries until 2012, when it was discovered under a parking lot. Richard didn't just fall in battle, he fell into legend. And the man who rose in his place? A shrewd survivor with a flair for symbols? Henry VII, architect of peace, designer of roses. Henry VII didn't win the crown by inheritance, he won it by betting everything on a single battle. After defeating Richard III at Bosworth, Henry knew he had to do more than win the war, he had to end it. And he did it not just with swords, but with symbols. His masterstroke? The Tudor rose. By combining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, he invented a floral logo of unity. It was political branding before political branding existed, England's first great PR stunt in petal form. It sent a clear message. The war is over. I'm in charge. Let's plant something nice. But Henry wasn't just into flowers. He was calculating, efficient, and deeply suspicious of everyone. He restored the monarchy's finances, tightened control over the nobility, and made sure rebellion died in committee. He also established a dynasty that would rule for over a century. Where others used brute force, Henry used account books and allegory, and he passed that balance of power and performance to his son, a king who composed music with one hand and wielded an axe with the other. Henry VIII, the musical tyrant who wrote a banger. Before he got busy founding churches, breaking from Rome, and disposing of wives like worn-out gloves, Henry VIII was something of a Renaissance heartthrob. Tall, athletic, charming, and surprisingly musically gifted. That's right. When he wasn't jousting or executing people, he was composing. His most famous piece? Pastime with Good Company, a catchy court favorite that practically screamed, "I love partying, politics, and polyphony." Henry's passion for music was legit. He played multiple instruments, lute, virginals, recorder, and surrounded himself with composers and musicians. His court was basically a Tudor music festival, minus the mud and overpriced cider. He didn't just enjoy music. He saw it as an extension of his majesty, his masculinity, and later, his midlife crisis. But music couldn't save him from the spiral. As his waistline expanded, so did his paranoia, tyranny, and number of wives. Yet, through it all, he kept composing, kept listening, kept orchestrating both melodies and mayhem. And his daughter Elizabeth, born of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, inherited more than his political instincts. She inherited enemies chief among them, a cousin whose ambition and charm proved fatally magnetic. Mary, Queen of Scots. The cousin who lost her head. Mary, Queen of Scots, had it all: beauty, charm, a royal bloodline, and the worst luck in dynastic politics. Cousin to Elizabeth I and heir to the English throne, at least according to Catholics, Mary spent her life in a high-stakes game of royal roulette. Her mere existence was a threat to Elizabeth, and to make things worse, Mary had a knack for choosing truly terrible husbands. After a scandal-ridden reign in Scotland and a forced abdication, she fled to England for protection. Mistake. Elizabeth saw her not as family, but as a walking, talking rebellion magnet. Still, Elizabeth didn't want to execute her. It took nearly 20 years of letters, plots, imprisonment, and failed assassinations before Mary finally signed her own death warrant by being linked to one plot too many. In 1587, she was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, leaving behind a legacy of political tragedy and martyrdom. Her son, ironically, would go on to inherit the English throne after Elizabeth's death. James I, the son, the Scot, and the unexpected heir. James I had one of the strangest job promotions in royal history. He started as the King of Scotland, James VI, to be precise, and ended up on the English throne as James I after the death of Elizabeth I. Why? Because he was the closest legitimate heir, thanks to an impressive bloodline that traced all the way back to Henry VII. Specifically, he was the great-great-great-grandson of Henry VII through his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, the same Mary who was executed by Elizabeth. So, technically, James inherited the throne from the woman who beheaded his mom. Awkward. Still, James played it cool. He walked into England not with an army, but with a pen and a vision of unity. He became the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, kicking off the Stuart dynasty and a whole new era of uneasy togetherness. He was also well-read, deeply interested in politics and theology, and slightly obsessed with the divine right of kings, which, to be fair, makes sense when you're constantly reminded your mom was executed by your predecessor. Next in line, a French Catholic queen who stirred up Protestant England's worst anxieties and married the king who'd lose his head and his throne. Henrietta Maria of France, the Queen England loved to hate. Henrietta Maria was everything England didn't want in a queen, French, Catholic, outspoken, and armed with a strong opinion on pretty much everything. When she married Charles I in 1625, Protestant England collectively winced. A Catholic queen consort in a land still nursing a Reformation hangover? That was a recipe for political indigestion. Henrietta Maria didn't help her case by throwing her weight around at court. She promoted Catholic allies, clashed with Parliament, and generally made Puritan MPs grind their teeth into powder. But she wasn't just meddling, she was fiercely loyal to Charles, raising funds for him during the English Civil War, rallying support abroad, and even returning to the battlefield zones of England when most royal spouses would have stayed on the continent, sipping fortified wine. Her public image, however, tanked. She was blamed for everything from poor policy decisions to weather, and her Catholic faith made her a lightning rod for anti-royalist sentiment. When Charles lost his war and his head, Henrietta Maria fled back to France, grieving and exiled. Her marriage may have been one of passion and political ruin, but her legacy lived on in her children, especially the son who brought back both the monarchy and a whole lot of party, Charles II, the party king with a killer comeback. Charles II didn't walk back into England after the monarchy's restoration in 1660 he danced in, probably with champagne in one hand and a mistress in the other. After years of exile, war, and watching his father get executed, Charles wasn't about to rule like a monk. He ruled like a man who had survived Puritanism and was ready to never be bored again. He reopened the theaters. He legalized Christmas again. He filled his court with scientists, artists, philosophers, and yes, a parade of mistresses. His court was bawdy, brilliant, and completely unbothered by the moral scowls of the previous regime. And at the center of it all was Charles himself, cracking jokes, sipping wine, and somehow keeping a fractured kingdom mostly glued together. But Charles wasn't just a charming hedonist. He was sharp, diplomatic, and keenly aware of the fragile balance between crown and parliament. He didn't seek revenge for his father's death. He just wanted a good drink and a functioning monarchy. And speaking of Charles's replacements, let's talk about his brother, the king, who thought being Catholic in Protestant England was a totally fine idea. James II, the king who ran the rebellion. James II took one look at the careful balance Charles II maintained and said, "Nah, let's go full Catholic." It was a bold strategy, and by bold, we mean suicidal in a country still traumatized by papal plots and Protestant paranoia. James was open about his faith, unapologetically so, and that openness made everyone in Parliament break into a constitutional cold sweat. He wasn't subtle. He put Catholics in high office, suspended anti-Catholic laws, and basically dared Parliament to stop him. They didn't at first. But when James had a son, a Catholic heir, England hit the panic button fast. No one wanted a new Catholic dynasty. Enter the Glorious Revolution, a polite coup if there ever was one. James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange were invited to invade. They did. James fled. And with barely a drop of blood spilled, he was out and constitutional monarchy was in. James went into exile, still convinced he was king, but England had moved on. And with William and Mary stepping into power, a new age began, one with fewer beheadings and more tulip bulbs. William III, the Dutchman who hunted and ruled with precision. William III didn't want the English throne. But when you're married to the heir and Parliament begs you to overthrow her dad, well, you make time. This Dutch prince was more soldier than statesman, more hunter than glad-hander, and more military raincloud than courtly sunshine. But make no mistake, he was effective. After the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary ruled as co-monarchs. Mary brought the charm, William brought the musket. A veteran of many continental campaigns, he was known for his icy determination, tactical brilliance, and love of hunting, like really loved hunting. When not fighting the French or navigating Parliament, he was out stalking deer with the same laser focus he applied to battle strategy. He wasn't particularly warm, or talkative, or physically imposing. He was asthmatic, short, and perpetually battling health issues. But he commanded respect, fear, and loyalty from those who valued competence over charisma. And when Mary died young, he ruled alone with grim efficiency. His reign reinforced Protestant power and constitutional monarchy in Britain. He didn't dazzle, but he delivered, which couldn't save the next monarch from heartbreak. She ruled alone and mourned 17 times. Queen Anne. 17 children, 0 survivors. Queen Anne's story is heartbreak wrapped in brocade. She was queen from 1702 to 1714, presiding over war victories, party politics, and the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain. But behind the crown was a woman utterly wrecked by loss. Anne was pregnant 17 times. Only one child lived past infancy, and even he died at age 11. That constant grief shaped her. Anne was deeply religious, often bedridden due to poor health, and emotionally dependent on her close female companions. Her most famous relationship, both political and personal, was with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Their friendship, intense and volatile, eventually imploded in a flurry of insults, manipulation, and a disastrous letter-writing campaign. Still, Anne wasn't weak. She navigated party politics like a seasoned brawler, managing Whigs and Tories with more skill than many give her credit for. Her reign saw the rise of parliamentary power and the solidifying of the modern constitutional monarchy. But her lack of an heir ended the Stuart dynasty. Enter the backup plan. A distant German relative with no English and zero chill brought in to keep the Protestant succession alive. George I, the king who didn't understand his own kingdom. George, I didn't speak English, didn't like England, and didn't want the job. But thanks to the Act of Settlement and a family tree with Protestant leaves, he got the throne anyway. Imported from Hanover in 1714 like a royal IKEA bookshelf, George arrived with limited vocabulary and even less enthusiasm. He communicated with his ministers in Latin because, somehow, that was easier. His court was divided. His son hated him. Parliament tolerated him. And the public? Let's just say he never made it onto souvenir mugs. George spent more time back in Hanover than in London, leaving the messy business of ruling to his ministers, most notably Robert Walpole, who became Britain's first unofficial prime minister, largely because George didn't want to deal with people. Still, his reign laid the groundwork for modern cabinet government, and his lack of personal charm accidentally became an asset. The monarchy stepped back, and Parliament stepped up. So while George I may not have inspired sonnets, he quietly rewired the entire British political system. His son, though? He had a flair for the dramatic, a love for battle, and a passion for very loud music. George II, the last monarch to charge into battle. George II wasn't a king who sat comfortably behind a desk and shuffled papers. He wanted action. So much so that in 1743, at the Battle of Dettingen, he personally led his troops into combat, making him the last British monarch ever to do so. That's right. While today's royals cut ribbons and wave politely, George II once mounted a horse, grabbed a sword, and charged at the enemy, yelling probably something very German and very aggressive. Despite being born and raised in Hanover, George had a complicated love-hate relationship with England. He was stiff, combative, and about as warm as a marble statue, but he was also efficient. He presided over military victories, navigated the rocky waters of parliamentary politics, and helped stabilize the Hanoverian dynasty at a time when Jacobites were still trying to stage comebacks with kilts and slogans. Battlefield glory aside, George also had a deep love for music. He was an avid patron of Handel, and under his reign, English music and arts flourished loudly, dramatically, and with a lot of harpsichord. But his wife? She wasn't just a royal consort. She was a woman with a garden, a microscope, and a serious interest in plants. Queen Charlotte, botanist, patron, and royal brainiac. Queen Charlotte wasn't your average 18th century royal wife. While her husband, George III, was busy being Farmer George, she was building one of the most impressive botanic collections in royal history. Her passion for plants wasn't a passive hobby, it was an active intellectual pursuit. She helped expand Kew Gardens, supported botanical expeditions, and corresponded with scientists across Europe. Forget tiaras, Charlotte wanted taxonomy charts. She was a patron of the arts, a keen reader, and a queen with a serious curiosity streak. She also raised 15 children, most of whom survived a feat in itself during an era where royal childbirth came with a 50/50th chance of tragedy. And yes, she was part of the elite club of women in science before STEM became a buzzword. Charlotte wasn't loud or flashy, but she left a deep imprint on the cultural and scientific landscape of the Georgian era. Kew Gardens remains a global center for botanical research, thanks in part to her enthusiasm for green things and curious minds. But the man who followed George III and inherited this blooming legacy was less about botany and more about velvet, gout, and epic home decor. George IV, the flamboyant king with a pavilion and a hangover. George IV was many things: a fashion icon, an art collector, a fan of excess, and, let's be honest, a royal train wreck in slow motion. Before he became king, he ruled as Prince Regent during his father's illness, and boy, did he take advantage of that head start. He ate lavishly, drank even more lavishly, and redecorated every room he entered until it screamed drama. His crowning aesthetic achievement, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, It looks like a Mughal palace had a baby with a Rococo fever dream. Domes, minarets, gilded dragons. It's like someone handed LSD to a team of royal architects. But the pavilion wasn't just a vanity project. It reflected his passion for global art and Eastern styles. He had expensive, overwhelming, opulent taste. Despite his flamboyance and flair, George IV did leave a mark on the monarchy. He was a patron of the arts, a lover of music, and a key figure in elevating the ceremonial spectacle of kingship. But he also racked up debts, battled with Parliament, and ballooned in size until he needed help getting out of bed. Still, at least he could own a scandal. His brother? He preferred dogs, sailors, and outrageous stories. William IV, the sailor king who talked too much. William IV was the royal equivalent of your eccentric uncle who once wrestled a bear and won't stop talking about it. Known as the Sailor King, William spent much of his early life in the Royal Navy, where he learned how to swear colorfully, drink heavily, and tell questionable stories with absolute confidence. He was the kind of monarch who would interrupt Parliament to share an unrelated anecdote about a sea battle that may or may not have happened. He never expected to be king. He was third in line, after all, and spent most of his youth treating duty like a vague suggestion. But when his older brothers died without heirs, he found himself unexpectedly on the throne at age 64. To everyone's surprise, he wasn't terrible at it. He supported key reforms, including the 1832 Reform Act that expanded voting rights. He slashed royal expenses. And he didn't completely alienate Parliament, which, for a Hanoverian, was basically sainthood. He was opinionated, unpredictable, and refreshingly unroyal. He also had 10 illegitimate children, a long-term mistress, and an open dislike for ceremony. But his reign helped bridge the gap between the autocratic past and the modern monarchy. Next came a queen who didn't just bridge that gap, she owned it. Prince Albert, the German brain behind the Victorian machine. Prince Albert wasn't just Queen Victoria's consort, he was her anchor, her advisor, her German-imported moral compass. While Victoria had the crown, Albert had the spreadsheets, the blueprints, and the game plan for dragging Britain kicking and screaming into modernity. He championed science, education, industry, and the arts. He even organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, basically the world's first tech fair, complete with giant glass palaces and weird machines. Albert wasn't flashy. He didn't chase glory or tabloids. He chased efficiency. He redesigned royal finances, streamlined court rituals, and helped make the monarchy seem less like a divine mystery and more like a well-run institution. And he did it all while being quietly handsome and very, very serious. His relationship with Victoria was intense. She adored him. When he died in 1861, she wore black for the rest of her life, turned Windsor into a shrine, and basically ghosted public life for a decade. The nation mourned, and the monarchy never quite felt the same again. Albert didn't live to see the full impact of his reforms, but his fingerprints were everywhere, including, quite literally, on Victoria's children, especially the son who would turn diplomacy into a personal hobby. Edward VII, the playboy who made peace look easy. Edward VII spent most of his life waiting for the crown while being publicly scolded by his mother for existing. He was the original royal bad boy partying across Europe, gambling, chasing actresses, and eating enough to make his tailor weep. But when Queen Victoria finally passed in 1901, Bertie, now in his 60s, did something shocking. He nailed the job. As king, Edward VII was a natural diplomat. Fluent in French, German, and charm, he used personal relationships to ease international tensions, most famously with France. His efforts helped secure the Entente Cordiale, a crucial alliance in the years before World War I. He wasn't a statesman in the traditional sense, but he knew the power of a handshake and a well-placed toast. His reign, though brief, ushered in the Edwardian era, a golden haze of elegance, optimism, and blissful ignorance before the world descended into war. He modernized the court, reshaped public ceremonies, and reminded everyone that charisma still mattered. Behind the indulgence was a man who understood that perception shaped politics, and when he died in 1910, the world mourned not just a king, but a performer who knew how to keep the show running. Next up, his son, who ruled through the world's first truly global catastrophe, with stamps. George V, the calm king in a world on fire. George V didn't have his father's flair or his grandfather's drama. What he had was stability. And in the early 20th century, that was the crown jewel of leadership. He took the throne in 1910 and guided Britain through World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the collapse of multiple European monarchies, all without ever raising his voice above stern but fair headmaster. He was solid, dependable, occasionally boring. But when bombs are falling and empires are unraveling, boring is exactly what you want. George V was the anti-flamboyant monarch. He wore sensible uniforms, kept detailed diaries, and spoke plainly to his people on the radio, his calm tone becoming the sound of royal reassurance during a world that seemed to be crumbling in real time. He also made one of the savviest PR moves in royal history. In 1917, with anti-German sentiment sky high, he changed the royal family's name from the very Teutonic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the proudly British House of Windsor. Suddenly, the monarchy wasn't foreign, it was homegrown. And while George V helped the monarchy survive the war, his son would nearly destroy it with a love story that sounded like a tabloid dream and a constitutional nightmare. Edward VIII, the king who couldn't keep his crown on. Edward VIII was born for the spotlight and couldn't wait to escape it. Handsome, fashionable, effortlessly charming, he was a walking magazine cover before photography even caught up. The public adored him. The aristocracy tolerated him. The establishment feared him. Because behind the tuxedos and tabloid smiles was a man who wanted love on his own terms, even if it meant torching the monarchy to get it. Enter Wallis Simpson, twice divorced American, stylish and absolutely not queen material, at least according to every bishop in the realm. But Edward didn't care. He wanted to marry her. The government said no, and in December 1936, he abdicated the throne after less than a year. His parting words? "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." Cue the royal mic drop. He became the Duke of Windsor and spent the rest of his life swanning around Europe, attending parties and occasionally dropping political opinions like they were cocktail olives. He was charming, tragic, and largely exiled from history. The crown fell to his brother, shy, stammering, and utterly unprepared. But what came next was nothing short of heroic. George VI, the quiet strength beneath the stammer. George VI didn't want to be king. He didn't train for it. He didn't enjoy the spotlight. But when his older brother abdicated, Bertie stepped up and led Britain through its darkest hour with a kind of stoic courage that didn't need speeches to be powerful. He struggled with a severe stammer, a fact known to his family and feared by his advisors. In an era when radio was the new battlefield of public opinion, George's inability to speak smoothly was seen as a national crisis. But with the help of speech therapist Lionel Logue, he battled his way through every syllable, turning each public address into an act of quiet defiance. And then came World War II. George refused to flee London during the Blitz, staying at Buckingham Palace even after it was bombed. He visited troops, hospitals, and bombed-out neighborhoods. His very presence became a symbol of shared sacrifice. He wasn't just ruling, he was standing with his people. He died in 1952, worn down by the pressure, smoking, and the sheer weight of duty. But his legacy lived on in his daughter, who would become the longest reigning monarch in British history, and the nation's quiet, unshakable constant. Elizabeth II, the queen who outlasted everyone. Elizabeth II wasn't just a monarch, she was an institution wrapped in pearls and corgis. Crowned in 1953, she reigned through 7 decades of history, 15 prime ministers, multiple royal scandals, and more global turbulence than an airport departure board. She met every U.S. president from Truman to Biden, except LBJ, his loss, ruled over a shrinking empire, and watched her family become permanent fixtures of the tabloid industrial complex. But through it all, she remained calm, steady, impeccably dressed. Her secret? Relentless duty and absolute emotional restraint. Elizabeth didn't do drama. She didn't do gossip. She did service, statecraft, and Christmas speeches. And while the world speculated endlessly about her inner thoughts, she kept that royal poker face locked tighter than the crown jewels. The monarchy modernized around her, but she remained its eternal still point, firmly rooted, dog-walking, and wave-perfecting her way through it all. And let's not forget her corgis. They weren't just pets. They were tiny, waddling icons of royal domesticity. She owned more than 30 over her lifetime, often breeding them herself. If Britain had a national dog, it'd have short legs and a royal pedigree. Now, the crown has passed to a man who waited longer than anyone else in history, patiently pruning roses all the while. Charles III, the eco-king with mud on his boots. Charles III didn't sprint to the throne, he slow-walked it for 70 years, pausing every so often to water the dahlias. Now, at last, the gardener-in-chief has become king. And unlike his ancestors who charged into power with armies, Charles brings compost, climate talks, and a portfolio of organic vegetables. As Prince of Wales, Charles was often mocked for talking to plants, railing against ugly architecture, and embracing environmental causes decades before they became mainstream. But now, those same views look eerily prescient. He was advocating for sustainable farming and climate change action back when most people thought eco meant recycling your tea bags. His pride and joy is Highgrove House, where his gardens are as curated as his speeches, full of passion, precision, and occasionally the unexpected frog. He's also a serious patron of the arts, with deep interests in classical music, painting, and the architecture of British heritage. Charles's reign marks a shift: less empire, more earth; less conquest, more conservation. And while he may never match his mother's mystique, he brings a different kind of royalty: human, thoughtful, and covered in mulch. Alfred the Great, the scholar king who saved English and England. Alfred the Great wasn't just a warrior king, he was a full-blown Renaissance man before the Renaissance was even a glimmer in Europe's future. While fighting off Viking invasions and patching together a fractured England, Alfred also managed to launch a literary revival that practically saved the English language from extinction. Latin was the language of the educated elite, but Alfred had a radical idea. What if people could actually read things in their own language? So he personally translated major Latin texts into Old English, including works by Boethius and Pope Gregory. And when he wasn't busy with a quill, he was commissioning others to do the same. Under his rule, books became tools of unity, education, and shockingly national identity. He believed learning was key to rebuilding a nation devastated by war, famine, and disunity. His reforms in education, legal systems, and military structure were transformative. He didn't just want a kingdom, he wanted a thinking kingdom, one where knowledge was power, not just swords. So yes, Alfred fought battles, but he also built schools, preserved culture, and jump-started English as a written language. A warrior by necessity, a scholar by design, and the only English king to earn the title, the Great. Canute the Great, the Viking king who knew his limits. Canute the Great wasn't your average medieval king. For one thing, he was a Viking, a Dane, who ruled not just England, but also Denmark and Norway, forming a short-lived North Sea empire. And yet, despite his fearsome origins, Canute turned out to be one of the most pragmatic, politically savvy rulers England ever had. But he's most famous for the one thing he didn't do: command the sea. In the story that has endured longer than his empire, Canute set a throne on the beach and ordered the tide to halt. Of course, the waves ignored him because physics and his robes got wet. Far from being a delusional egomaniac, Canute was making a point. Not even a king could defy the laws of nature. It was an epic mic-drop moment in medieval humility. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Canute wanted to show his courtiers and probably a few overzealous flatterers that royal power had limits. But make no mistake, Canute ruled with iron resolve. He respected English customs, kept peace among his various realms, and even made pilgrimages to Rome to strengthen his legitimacy. He ruled wisely, he ruled well, and when the waves came in, he stood still, reminding everyone what true power looked like. Edward the Confessor, crownless in spirit, flower, circled in style. Edward the Confessor was the king who didn't want a crown, literally. He reportedly wore a circlet of flowers instead of a proper crown because he thought humility was more divine than diamonds. You've got to admire a guy who ran a kingdom dressed like he was attending a May Day festival. Piety was Edward's entire brand. He was deeply religious, so much so that he often left the business of ruling to his advisors while he focused on prayer, fasting, and apparently accessorizing like a medieval woodland sprite. His court wasn't exactly a hotbed of intrigue. It was more like a church service with occasional tax collection. But his influence was far from weak. He founded Westminster Abbey, which would become the beating ceremonial heart of British royalty. And even though his reign wasn't packed with military conquests, his death kicked off one of the most chaotic succession crises in English history, the prelude to the Norman conquest. Edward was canonized as a saint in 1161, which made him the only English king to be officially declared holy. It's ironic. Really, his peaceful, contemplative life sparked a war that would change England forever. And that war? It started when his successor caught an arrow with his face, Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king and the human target at Hastings. Harold Godwinson had the kind of year that makes you wonder why medieval England didn't invent stress leave. Crowned king in January 1066, he spent the next 10 months fighting off invasions from every direction. First, he beat back the Norwegians at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September, an impressive victory by any standard. Unfortunately, while he was still wiping Viking blood off his sword, William of Normandy was landing on the southern coast. Cue the Battle of Hastings. The 14th of October, 1066. Harold's army, exhausted but determined, faced William's fresher, better-equipped forces. The battle raged all day. It was brutal, chaotic, and historic. And then came the arrow, the one that supposedly struck Harold in the eye, turning him into both a tragic symbol and the answer to every high school history test in England. With Harold's death, the Anglo-Saxon era ended. The Normans took over, reshaping England's language, laws, architecture, and aristocracy. Harold wasn't a bad king. He was just wildly unlucky, sandwiched between two invasions and doomed by timing. He went down swinging. But the man who took his place at the top, he wouldn't just change England. He'd count it, tax it, and document it page by meticulous page. William the Conqueror, tax king and book hoarder. After William the Conqueror won the English crown in 1066, he didn't just sit back and bask in his victory. No, he wanted receipts. So, in 1085, he ordered what would become the most detailed national survey of the medieval world, the Domesday Book. Picture a royal accountant with an iron quill marching through every village, asking how much land you owned, how many pigs you had, and whether your neighbor owed you a goat. This wasn't just obsessive bookkeeping, it was genius governance. William used the Domesday Book to calculate taxes, settle disputes, and assert control over a land still very much reeling from conquest. It covered over 13,000 settlements and became the backbone of the English feudal system. No property, no cow, no haystack escaped its pages. It was called the Domesday Book because it was as final and indisputable as Judgment Day. Once it was written down, there was no arguing. You either paid your dues, or you found yourself on the business end of Norman justice. William didn't just conquer England. He counted it, audited it, and organized it until every acre bent to his will. But even taxmasters have blind spots, especially when they go hunting with friends and forget to watch their backs. William II, the Red King and the Forest Mystery. William II, known as William Rufus, meaning the Red, either for his complexion or his personality, inherited the throne from his father, William the Conqueror. But unlike his father's iron discipline, Rufus brought chaos, arrogance, and a taste for drama. He ruled from 1087 until 1100, and his reign was marked by clashes with the church, barons, and, well, basic likability. He wasn't exactly pious, polite, or particularly popular. He levied heavy taxes, mocked religious figures, and lived a flamboyant lifestyle that made chroniclers clutch their medieval pearls. He wasn't married, he had no heirs, and then there was the hunting trip. In 1100, William was killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. The shot allegedly fired by nobleman Walter Tyrrell struck him square in the chest. Was it an accident? Maybe. Was it a conspiracy? Almost definitely maybe. Tyrrell fled the country immediately. William's body was left on the forest floor for hours while his nobles scrambled to crown the next king. William Adelin, the prince who sank the kingdom. William Adelin, only legitimate son of Henry I, had one job: stay alive long enough to become king. Unfortunately, he boarded the White Ship in 1120, a luxurious, party-ready vessel meant to carry the young nobles of England across the English Channel, and that ship became the Titanic of the 12th century. Loaded with wine, laughter, and too much entitlement, the White Ship hit a rock near the coast of Normandy and sank with nearly everyone on board. William, just a teenager, initially escaped in a lifeboat, but then he heard his half-sister screaming for help and turned back to rescue her. That decision doomed him. The lifeboat capsized. He drowned, and with him died the future of a smooth royal succession. Henry, I was devastated. His grief wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. With no other legitimate male heirs, the throne was suddenly up for grabs. Henry named his daughter, Matilda, as his successor, but the nobility wasn't keen on being ruled by a woman. When Henry died, England collapsed into a 19-year civil war called the Anarchy, a feud between Matilda and her cousin Stephen that made Game of Thrones look like a Sunday picnic. And speaking of Stephen, he was next in line, bow in hand and chaos in tow. Stephen, the Archer King of civil chaos. Stephen of Blois wasn't supposed to be king, but when King Henry I died in 1135 without a surviving male heir, Stephen moved fast, really fast. While Matilda, the designated successor and Henry's daughter, was busy being female, a big problem for medieval politics, Stephen was busy getting crowned. He won the backing of London, the church, and the nobility before Matilda could say, "Excuse me, I had next." What followed was nearly 2 decades of chaos, known as the Anarchy. England turned into a massive, bloody tug-of-war, with castles changing hands faster than you could reload a longbow. Stephen wasn't a bad guy. He was charismatic, brave, and reportedly one of the best archers in England. But as a king, he was about as consistent as medieval plumbing. Despite early support, Stephen's reign devolved into a patchwork of rival barons, broken oaths, and sieges so brutal they inspired generations of horror stories. He held on to the throne barely, but had to agree that Matilda's son Henry would succeed him. Stephen died in 1154, exhausted and probably relieved to be done with it all. And when Henry II took the throne, he didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a royal mess to clean up. Henry II, the chess, playing king who argued with saints. Henry II was not the kind of king you challenge to a board game. He was sharp, strategic, and a little terrifying when provoked. And provoke him, you did so at your own risk. Just ask Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who went from Henry's best friend to public martyr over what started, legend has it, as a disagreement over a game of chess. Whether or not the chessboard story is literal or symbolic, their falling out was very real. Henry wanted control over the church's legal authority. Becket, once his drinking buddy, refused. The resulting feud escalated until Henry allegedly muttered something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard it and took it as an order. Becket was butchered at the altar of Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, a crime so shocking it echoed through Europe. Henry II was many things: a brilliant reformer, a builder of empire, a legal innovator. But he was also volatile, moody, and constantly at war with his own family. His reign laid the foundations for English common law and for centuries of royal dysfunction. Speaking of dysfunction, let's talk about his son, the man who turned battle into legend and left his heart somewhere in France. Richard the Lionheart, the king who left his heart in Rouen. Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, is what you get when you cross a medieval rock star with a crusading action hero. Tall, golden-haired, fluent in multiple languages, and always up for a fight, Richard spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. The rest of the time, he was off sword, swinging through the Holy Land, crushing rebellions in France, and getting kidnapped in Austria. Seriously. Despite his absence, Richard became a mythic figure. He fought in the Third Crusade against Saladin and won enough battles to get songs written about him, even though he didn't actually retake Jerusalem. But who needs a win when you've got branding? When he died in 1199, from a crossbow wound during a minor siege, his body was buried in one place, his entrails in another, and his heart in Rouen Cathedral because, when you're a legend, Even your remains deserve multiple mailing addresses. Richard was brave, reckless, and deeply uninterested in governance. But England loved him anyway, turning him into the medieval hero of storybooks and statues. Too bad the guy who followed him was the exact opposite, less Lionheart, more illegible handwriting and constitutional disaster. King John, the scribbling disaster behind the Magna Carta. King John had one big claim to fame. He signed the Magna Carta, and that's great, but before you hand him a gold star, know this: he didn't sign it because he believed in freedom and justice. He signed it because his barons were ready to shove it down his throat if he didn't. John was the kind of king who managed to lose more land than he governed, taxed everyone into oblivion, and made enemies so consistently you'd think it was on his to-do list. His nickname? Lackland. That's not a metaphor, he literally lost Normandy. His other talents included starving prisoners to death, backstabbing nobles, and hilariously having handwriting so bad that scribes often had to rewrite his royal letters just so people could read them. He was excommunicated by the Pope, nearly overthrown by his own nobles, and then forced under duress to accept the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that limited royal power and became the seed of modern constitutional law. But John didn't reform. He plotted revenge, started another war, and promptly died of dysentery. The barons sighed in relief. The scribes probably threw a quiet celebration. Up next, his son, who spoke multiple languages, loved books, and rebuilt more than just his father's image. Henry III, the bookish builder of Westminster. Henry III had the unenviable task of following King John, which is sort of like being handed a crumbling castle made of wet paper and told to host a banquet. But Henry leaned into his strengths. He was pious, patient, and extremely into art, architecture, and things written in Latin. Crowned as a boy in the middle of civil unrest, Henry ruled for over 50 years longer than any English king before him, and spent much of that time building things. His crowning achievement? The transformation of Westminster Abbey from a modest church into a Gothic masterpiece. Think soaring arches, glittering mosaics, and enough pointed windows to give a glazier carpal tunnel. Henry adored ceremony, symbolism, and saints. He commissioned illuminated manuscripts, collected holy relics, and tried very hard to be the kind of king who ruled through grace rather than fear. But his love of beauty and ritual often left him blind to political realities. He faced multiple rebellions, including one led by his own brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort, who temporarily booted him from power. But Henry clung on, more bookworm than warlord, and left behind a kingdom with deeper cultural roots. Then came his son, tall, fearsome, and very much ready to hammer things, especially if they had a Scottish accent. Edward I, the Hammer, the Architect, and the Iron King. Edward I didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a nation itching for order, dominance, and the kind of monarch who didn't flinch at blood. Nicknamed the Hammer of the Scots, Edward was not subtle. He conquered Wales, crushed opposition, and went to war with Scotland so often it became his personal obsession. If diplomacy didn't work, he sent the cavalry. But Edward wasn't just a conqueror, he was also a builder, literally. The castles he commissioned in Wales, like Caernarfon and Conwy, weren't just military fortresses. They were psychological warfare in stone. Designed with symmetry, grandeur, and overwhelming force, they declared to any would-be rebel, "Good luck storming this." And he didn't stop at castles. Edward also revamped the legal system, summoned what would become the model for Parliament, and tried to shape England into a modern, centralized kingdom. He could be ruthless, especially toward the Scots and the Jews, but he was effective and terrifyingly efficient. He died en route to yet another campaign in Scotland, still clinging to the belief that England's dominance had to be absolute. His son would inherit the throne, but not the Iron Will.